anyone already knew it. If this kind of story speaks to you, real women, real grit, real love built on something stronger than convenience, subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you never miss one. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The telegram had been clear enough. Bride arriving. June 14th. Boston line. Name Evelyn Brooks. Age 28. Education Wellesley College. References attached. Wyatt had read it twice and folded it into his breast pocket and thought, educated fine. He'd had educated horses. Educated didn't mean difficult. He was wrong. The platform at Red Mesa Junction was already baking at 10:30 in the morning when the train exhaled its last breath of steam and the passengers began filing out. Wyatt stood with his hat in his hands, a gesture his foreman Hector said made him look approachable, which was why he did it exactly once per year. Always in June, always when something was watching him, he couldn't afford to spook. He spotted her immediately. Not because she was the prettiest woman on the platform, though she wasn't hard on the eyes. He spotted her because she was the only person who stepped off that train and looked around like she was already calculating something. Most brides in Wyatt had been to enough weddings to know this arrived with their eyes soft. Hopeful. A little frightened. Evelyn Brooks arrived with her eyes moving. Fence line to water tower, to livery to him in that order. She catalogued him the way a buyer catalogs a horse at auction. Briefly, thoroughly, without emotion. Then she picked up her suitcase, tucked her notebook under her arm, and walked directly to him. "Mr. Calloway." "Miss Brooks, I'd like to see your water ledgers before we reach the ranch." She set the suitcase down between them. "I've spent the last 3 days on the train reading every land record I could access for Red Mesa Valley. You lost 17% of your southern herd in the drought of 1882. I want to understand your current reservoir capacity before I form any opinions about your operation." Wyatt put his hat back on his head very slowly. "We haven't shaken hands yet." She extended hers. "Evelyn Brooks, pleased to meet you, Mr. Calloway. Now the ledgers." He shook it. Her grip was firm. Her eyes didn't waver. Behind him he heard Hector make a sound that was not quite a cough and not quite a laugh, and was entirely too much of both. Ton. The drive to the Double C took 40 minutes in the wagon, and Wyatt had planned it as a kind of orientation. He'd point out the eastern boundary markers, explain the layout of the south pasture, tell her about the bunkhouse situation and the cook's schedule, and the fact that the ranch hands were good men but suspicious of strangers, and she'd do well not to question them in front of each other. He got 3 sentences out before Evelyn opened her notebook. Not to write. To show him. She'd drawn a rough map. Hand-sketched, detailed in a way that made his stomach tighten because she hadn't been to Red Mesa Valley before this morning, and yet the proportions were nearly right. "I estimated from the land records," she said. "Your northern boundary runs along Cutter Creek. Your primary reservoir is here." She tapped a pencil mark, fed from the creek's eastern fork. "Your bunkhouse is on the opposite side of the main structure from the barn, which means your hands are walking an unnecessary quarter-mile every morning before first chores." Wyatt looked at the map, then at her. "You drew that on the train." "I drew it in St. Louis. I had time to refine it in Amarillo." She turned to a fresh page. "What's your current daily water usage per head?" "Miss Brooks?" "Evelyn." "Evelyn." He said it carefully like he was testing the weight of it. "We're not at the ranch yet." "No, but we will be in 32 minutes, and I'd rather arrive with context than without it." She looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely unyielding. "I'm not asking to be difficult, Mr. Calloway. I'm asking because I intend to be useful, and I can't be useful if I'm uninformed." He told her the water usage figures. He wasn't sure why. Something about the directness of the question made evasion feel like the more embarrassing option. She wrote the numbers down without comment. Then, "That's high. About 12% above what I'd expect for a herd your size in June. Where's the loss?" "Might be the South Trough. Been meaning to check the seal." "We'll check it this afternoon." Wyatt turned to look at her fully. She was already writing something else. In the back of his mind, something that felt like respect was having a very uncomfortable argument with something that felt like irritation, and neither of them was winning. Hector Martinez had worked the Double C for 11 years. He'd seen Wyatt navigate a cattle stampede, a lawsuit over water rights, and a Christmas Eve fire that took the old equipment barn down to ash. He'd never once seen Wyatt Calloway look genuinely uncertain about what to do with his hands. He looked uncertain now. Evelyn Brooks stepped down from the wagon, took one long look at the main house, and said, "The porch is rotting on the northeast corner. You'll want to replace that before winter, or you'll lose the whole east side of the foundation." Then she walked toward the barn. Hector looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Hector. "She's something," Hector said. "She's something." Wyatt agreed with the tone of a man who had not yet decided if that was a good thing. He followed her to the barn. She was already inside, moving along the stall line with her notebook open, pausing at each horse to note something, stopping at the feed storage to press her thumb into a bag of grain and examine what came back on her skin. "This is damp," she said without turning around. "We had rain last week. The moisture's working in from the floor seam, not from the top. That means your drainage on the west side of the barn is channeling water inward instead of away. You're going to lose this grain if you don't address the seal before your next delivery." She turned around. "What's your relationship with the lumber merchant in town?" "Good relationship. Why?" "Because I'd like to get the order in today. I can draft the specifications this evening." Wyatt stood in the entrance of his own barn and felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he didn't have immediate language for. It wasn't offense. It wasn't admiration. It was something more unsettling than either, the distinct feeling of encountering someone who operated at a frequency he hadn't known existed. "You've been here 20 minutes, he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I work quickly. I hope that isn't a problem." He wanted to say, "It depends on what you're working on." He wanted to say, "I hired a wife, not a foreman." He wanted to say a number of things that, under the weight of her clear, patient gaze, all dissolved before they reached his mouth. "It's not a problem," he said. She nodded once, turned back to the grain bags, and kept writing. The ranch hands gathered at the supper table that evening with the specific alertness of men who had heard things through the walls and were now trying to assess the situation with their own eyes. There were 7 of them. Hector, who was 43 and had seen everything. Pete Dunmore, who was 26 and nervous. Old Cal Briggs, who was 61 and had the posture of a man who had once been a soldier and never fully stopped being one. And 4 others who arranged themselves in the order they always did, by seniority and by how much they thought before speaking. Evelyn came to the table last, having changed into a simpler dress, and put her hair back in a way that was practical rather than decorative. She sat down, looked around at the 7 men watching her, and said, "I know you've been wondering, so let me say it plainly. I'm not here to change how you work. I'm here to understand how the ranch works, and if there are ways to make it work better, I'll raise them with Mr. Calloway first. Nothing changes without his agreement. But I will ask questions, and I'd appreciate honest answers." Silence. Then Cal Briggs, 61 years old, former cavalry, hadn't volunteered information to anyone in a decade, said, "What do you want to know?" "Tell me about the South Trough," she said. "Mr. Calloway mentioned the seal might be failing. How long has it been losing water?" Cal glanced at Wyatt. Wyatt gave a small nod. "Since April," Cal said. "Maybe March." "How much are you losing per day, roughly?" 15-20 gallons. Maybe more on a hot afternoon." Evelyn wrote it down. "And the north fence line, you repaired the middle section last fall, but the eastern end is original construction." Pete Dunmore put down his fork. "How do you know about the north fence?" "Land records. Survey notes from 1879 and 1885. The original posts are oak, which means they're holding, but the wire gauge used in that era is lighter than what you'd use now. If you have a heavy cattle push against that section, it'll go." She looked at him directly. "I'm not criticizing whoever put it up. I'm noting it because it's a liability worth knowing. Pete looked at Hector. Hector was looking at his plate, but there was something around the corners of his mouth that was almost a smile. Wyatt ate his supper and said very little, and watched the woman he had married 6 hours ago systematically and methodically dismantle 11 years' worth of assumptions that the Double C was being run about as well as it could be. She wasn't cruel about it. She wasn't arrogant. She was simply precise in the way that a good surgeon is precise, not cold, but focused with a quality of attention that left no room for imprecision. By the end of supper, Cal Briggs had given her the full history of the South Trough problem, going back to the winter of 1884. Pete Dunmore had told her about the water pressure issues in the main line. Hector had mentioned unprompted that the east pasture grass had been thinning for 2 seasons, and he'd been meaning to rotate the herd, but hadn't brought it up because the previous year's water shortage had made it feel like the wrong conversation to start. Evelyn listened to all of it, wrote all of it down, said thank you specifically and genuinely to each man who contributed. Then she looked at Wyatt and said, "After supper, can we talk through the water ledgers?" He said yes, because by then he couldn't imagine saying anything else. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table with the ledgers between them and a lamp that cast more shadow than light, and Wyatt watched her turn pages and run her finger along columns of figures the way a musician runs their fingers along notes, not reading exactly. Feeling. "Your 1885 numbers are off," she said, not dramatically, "but you're reconciling water expenditure against head count at the start of the month, not the midpoint. If you had deaths or sales in the first 2 weeks, your usage rates look more efficient than they were. The hands kept those records. I approve them. I know. I'm not finding fault." She turned the page. "I'm trying to understand your true baseline. Because if another drought comes, we manage it the same way we managed the last one." She looked up. "How did you manage the last one?" "A beat. We lost 17% of the South herd." "Yes," she said quietly. "You did." It landed without cruelty, but it landed. And Wyatt found himself doing something he almost never did with anyone sitting with the discomfort of it, rather than pushing it away. "What would you have done differently?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She turned back 2 pages, then 3, then found what she was looking for. "Your reservoir capacity is roughly 4,000 gallons. Your daily usage in summer at peak herd size is around 300 gallons. That gives you 13 days of reserve if Cutter Creek goes dry." She looked at him. In 1885, how many days was the creek at reduced flow before the worst of it hit? He thought. 11, 12 maybe? So you had almost no margin. "We had almost no margin," he agreed. "With a secondary cistern on the north slope, you have a natural depression there. I saw it in the survey. You could add another 1,500 gallons of capacity. That's 5 more days. The difference between 17% losses and breaking even." She closed the ledger. "I can design the cistern. I'll need timber and a good mason. Do you have a mason you trust?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. The lamp flickered. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a horse shifted in its stall. "Jim Alcott in town," he said. "Good man. Can we meet with him this week? I'll send for him tomorrow." She nodded and wrote something in her notebook. He watched her write and thought about the telegram in his breast pocket and the word practical, and realized that practical was the most inadequate word he had ever read. "Evelyn." She looked up. "Why did you agree to this?" He gestured vaguely at the ledgers, the lamp, the ranch, the whole improbable situation. "A marriage arrangement. To a stranger. In Texas. You went to Wellesley." She held his gaze for a long moment, and for the first time since she had stepped off that train, something shifted in her expression, not vulnerability exactly, but something closer to the truth beneath the competence. "My father lost his business 2 years ago," she said. "I've been managing the household accounts, the creditors, the remaining assets. I've been doing the work of a financial manager with the title of oldest unmarried daughter, and being paid exactly nothing for it." She paused. "The arrangement gave me a chance to do meaningful work with legitimate authority. I took it." And if I'd been a different kind of man. Her eyes were very steady. I read extensively about you before I agreed. Land records, court filings, business correspondence that passed through public record, credit history, character references from men who had no reason to flatter you. She let that settle. You've never cheated a supplier. You've never fired a man without cause. You settled a water rights dispute with your neighbor 8 years ago by paying him fairly rather than litigating. You gave your foreman a share of the spring calf profits in 1883 when he would have had no legal recourse to ask for it. She tilted her head slightly. I knew what kind of man you were before I packed my suitcase, Mr. Calloway. The room was very quiet. Wyatt, he said. I beg your pardon. If I'm calling you Evelyn, you should call me Wyatt. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and was more interesting than one. All right, she said. Wyatt. He reached across the table and turned the ledger back to the page she'd flagged. Show me the baseline calculation again, he said. I want to understand how you're running it. She pulled the ledger toward her and started to explain. He leaned forward and listened. Really listened the way he hadn't listened to anyone explain anything in longer than he could remember. Outside the Texas night, pressed down on the Double C ranch, hot and heavy, and full of things that were coming whether anyone was ready or not. Inside the lamp burned low, and the two of them worked through numbers and plans and the particular silence that falls between two people who are beginning to understand each other. It was well past midnight when Evelyn looked up from the ledger and realized the lamp was nearly out of oil. We should stop, she said. Probably. He didn't move. She looked at him, really looked at him the way she had on the platform cataloging. But it was different now. Less assessment. More something she didn't have a column for in her notebook. You're not what I expected either, she said. He met her eyes. What did you expect? Someone who would tolerate me for the household management and ignore me for everything else. She said it without self-pity, the way you state a fact about the weather. That's the standard arrangement. Is that what you wanted? No. She gathered her notebook. It's what I prepared for. She stood, and he stood with her, and for a moment, they were simply two people standing on opposite sides of a table in a kitchen in Texas, surrounded by ledgers and the smell of lamp oil and the particular weight of a day that had been unlike any either of them had anticipated. Good night, Wyatt, she said. Good night, Evelyn. She walked down the hall to the room he'd prepared for her practical clean, with a decent writing desk because Hector had suggested it, and Wyatt had agreed without fully understanding why. He heard the door close. He sat back down at the table in the dark and put both hands flat on the cover of the ledger she'd been working in. Ordered a wife, he thought. Practical, sturdy, no surprises. He almost laughed. It came out something closer to a long, slow exhale that carried with it the specific feeling of a man who has just realized that the ground under his feet is not the ground he thought he was standing on. Down the hall, he could see the thin line of lamplight under her door. She was still working. Of course she was. He sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the ranch settle into night around him, and thought about secondary cisterns and water ledgers, and the way she'd said his name, Wyatt, like she was testing the weight of it exactly the same way he had tested hers. The South Trough was losing 20 gallons a day. The east fence line was original construction and a liability. The barn's drainage was channeling moisture into the grain storage. The north slope had a natural depression that could hold 1,500 additional gallons. And the woman who had walked off the train that morning already knew all of it. He finally got up, pushed in his chair, and walked down the hallway to his own room. He passed her door. The light was still on. He paused for just a moment. From inside the quiet, steady scratch of a pen moving across paper, he kept walking. But he carried that sound with him all the way to sleep, the sound of someone doing the work long after everyone else had stopped. The sound of someone who had not come to be managed or to be decorative or to fill a space in a house that needed filling. The sound of someone who had come, as she had said, to be useful. He hadn't known how much he needed useful until it arrived on the noon train with a leather notebook and a question about his water ledgers. The Double C Ranch slept, The Texas stars burned hard and indifferent overhead. And somewhere on the north slope, in a natural depression in the earth that Wyatt Calloway had walked past 1,000 times without seeing it, 1,500 gallons of possibility were waiting for someone to build around them. She had seen it from a survey map from 600 miles away before she had ever set foot on the land. He was still thinking about that when he finally closed his eyes. The light under her door was gone by 2 in the morning. Wyatt knew because he hadn't fully slept. He'd lain in the dark, listening to the ranch, the way he always did, when something was working on him, cataloging sounds, sorting the normal, from the not giving his mind something concrete to do, while the bigger thing circled underneath. The creak of the water tower. The horses shifting. The distant complaint of a coyote somewhere past the South Ridge. And then at some point past midnight, the thin thread of light that had been visible under her door simply stopped. He told himself he only noticed because he'd gotten up for water. He wasn't entirely sure that was true. At 5 in the morning, he was dressed and in the kitchen, and Evelyn Brooks. Evelyn Calloway, technically, though neither of them had used that name yet, was already at the table with a fresh pot of coffee, her notebook open, and a piece of paper covered in hand-drawn diagrams that she'd clearly been working on since before the sun had any business rising. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up at 4:30. She didn't look up. "Coffee's on the stove." He poured himself a cup and looked over her shoulder at the diagram. It took him a moment to recognize it, the north slope rendered in careful pencil lines with measurements notated along each edge. The proposed cistern site. She'd worked out the grade, the inlet angle, the overflow drainage path. "You drew this morning," he said. "Last night and this morning." She turned the paper so he could see it more fully. "The grade runs about 6 degrees east, which means the overflow, if we get it, will drain naturally toward the creek rather than pooling. We won't need a pump. Gravity does the work." He studied it. The numbers were right. He could see that without running them himself, which unsettled him slightly, not because she was wrong, but because she was so clearly not wrong, that disagreement would have required bad faith. "Jim Alcott is going to want to see this," he said. "I made a second copy." She produced it from beneath the first. "Cleaner lines. He can keep it for reference." Keep. Wyatt sat down across from her and drank his coffee and watched her add a notation to the margin of the first diagram and thought 4:30. She was up at 4:30, making duplicate technical drawings for a mason she hadn't met yet for a ranch she'd arrived at 16 hours ago. "Evelyn? Did you sleep?" She looked up. 3 hours. I function adequately on 3 hours. A pause. I always have. That's not... He stopped, started again. That's not a sustainable practice. Something shifted in her expression. Not offense, more like the mild surprise of someone who has been told the temperature and hadn't expected anyone to notice they were cold. "I'm aware," she said. "I'll sleep more once I understand the operation well enough to stop worrying about what I don't know." He looked at her across the table. The early light was thin and gray, and she had a small ink smudge on the side of her left hand, and her hair was pinned but not as carefully as it had been the day before, and she looked not diminished exactly. More like herself, like the version of herself she was when no one was supposed to be watching. "What else is worrying you?" he said. She set down her pencil. It was the first time since he'd known her, all 16 hours of it, that she'd done that voluntarily, without finishing what she was working on first. "The feed storage situation is worse than the grain bag suggested," she said. "I looked at your supplier records last night. You're ordering at the same volume you ordered 3 years ago, but your herd has grown by about 20%. You're running thin margins on winter feed every year, and covering it with emergency purchases that cost you more per unit than a forward contract would." He was quiet. "I'm not criticizing your purchasing decisions," she said quickly. "You've been managing 100 other things. Feed scheduling isn't glamorous. Nobody notices it until it's a crisis. How much has it cost me?" She turned to a page in her notebook. "Over the last 3 winters, based on the ledger figures and typical spot market rates for this region, roughly $400 in excess cost. Maybe $450, $400. He ran the number against what he knew of the Double C's margins and felt the specific discomfort of a man who has just discovered a leak he'd been too busy to find. "Can you fix it?" he said. "I can draft a forward contract proposal for your current supplier. If he won't negotiate volume pricing, I know 2 others in the region who might." She picked the pencil back up. "But I'd want to discuss it with you before I make any contact. This is your relationship. I don't want to walk into it without your read on the man." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. "His name is Bernard Colley. Good businessman, honest, but he doesn't like to feel cornered. You come at him with numbers, he'll get defensive. You come at him with a problem you need his help solving, he'll bend over backwards." She wrote that down, not the contract details, his read on the man. She wrote down the human information. "That's useful," she said. "Thank you. You're welcome." He paused. "Evelyn, the $400. Don't lose sleep over telling me that." She looked at him steadily. "I wasn't sure how you'd receive it." "I receive it as information I needed." He held her gaze. "That's all. That's what I want from you. Don't soften things to manage my reaction." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it. The weight of something being established, a principle being laid down between 2 people who are still learning the shape of each other. "All right," she said. "I won't." Hector arrived at 6:15 to find his boss and the new wife deep in a conversation about east pasture grass rotation that had apparently been going on for some time. He poured his coffee, sat down at the end of the table, and listened for 5 minutes before either of them acknowledged he was there. "She's right about the rotation," he said when there was a gap. "I've been saying it to myself for 2 seasons. Wyatt looked at him. "You've been saying it to yourself. Didn't want to add to the pile." Hector shrugged, unapologetic. "But she's right. We rotate the herd east by July 1st, let the south recover through August. We'll have better grass going into fall than we've had in 3 years. Evelyn looked at Hector with the expression of someone filing a piece of information in the right place. "How long have you been watching the south pasture thin?" "Since '86. And the herd pressure on it has increased because we added the 30 head from the Morrison sale in '85 and put them south because the north fence wasn't reliable." He glanced at Wyatt. "Still isn't reliable." "We know," Wyatt said. "That's on the list." "What's at the top of the list?" Hector asked. "Cistern first," Evelyn said. "Then grain storage drainage. Then the south trough seal. Then the north fence." She looked at Wyatt. "In that priority order, assuming you agree." He agreed. He'd been mentally ranking them the same way while she talked. "Send Pete and Cal to look at the trough seal today," he told Hector. "I want to know how bad it is before we order material." Hector nodded, took his coffee. He paused at the door. "Ma'am," he said to Evelyn. "Hector," she said. "Welcome to the Double C." It was 11 words and 0 ceremony, and from Hector Martinez, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Pete Dunmore did not share Hector's early accommodation. He was 26, and he'd been at the Double C for 3 years, and in those 3 years, he'd built up a body of knowledge about how the ranch ran that he was quietly, justifiably proud of. He knew where every fence post was on the south line. He knew the temperament of every horse in the barn. He knew which water lines ran slow in cold weather, and which ones froze entirely if you didn't drain them before November. He did not enjoy the experience of watching someone arrive on a Tuesday and start reorganizing the knowledge he'd spent 3 years accumulating. By Wednesday afternoon, he was making it visible. Evelyn had asked him to walk the south trough line with her, not to supervise. She'd said, just to show her the physical layout so the figures in the ledger had a real-world reference. Pete walked it. Answered questions in the minimal way of a man who is technically cooperating and emotionally not. One-word answers. No volunteered context. His shoulders carried a tension that was clear to anyone who knew how to read people. Evelyn read it clearly. She stopped at the midpoint of the trough line where the seal damage was worst and said, "Pete, can I ask you something directly?" He crossed his arms. "Sure. What specifically am I doing that's bothering you? Because something is, and I'd rather know it plainly than work around it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the resignation of a man whose position has just been made untenable by a direct question, "You've been here 2 days." "I have. And you've already got Cal talking about fence timelines, and Hector talking about pasture rotation, and the boss talking about cisterns. Things that have been sitting for years. Does that bother you because they're moving, or because you feel like it happened without you?" His jaw tightened. "I've been here 3 years. I know." She said it without apology, but also without dismissal. "And everything I've found in the last 2 days you already knew. The trough, the grain storage, the fence, the pasture. You've been watching all of it." She looked at him evenly. "Why haven't you raised it?" The honest answer moved across his face before he could stop it. She watched it land, the particular shame of someone who knows the answer is not flattering. "I didn't think—" He stopped. "You didn't think anyone would listen," she said. The silence was total. "I'll listen," she said. "Every time. That's not a courtesy, Pete. It's practical. You've been walking this land for 3 years, and I've been here 2 days. Whatever I see in a ledger, you can see the thing itself. I need that." A pause. "And Mr. Calloway needs it, and right now he's not getting it because you're holding it back." Pete Dunmore stared at the trough for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms. "The east line of the south fence," he said. "Not just the wire. 2 of the posts are rotting at the base. I checked them last month. Another hard season and they'll go at the first real push." "Have you walked that section recently?" 3 weeks ago." "Can you show me?" He showed her. She walked the entire east line with him, asked questions that were specific enough that he stopped giving minimal answers and started giving full ones. And by the time they turned back toward the ranch, it was late afternoon, and Pete Dunmore was explaining the history of the east fence going back to a storm in 1879 with the detail and fluency of someone who has finally been asked the right question. "You know this ranch?" she said when he finished. "Yeah." He said it with a kind of rough pride. "Good. I need someone who knows it." She closed her notebook. "I hope I can count on you." He was quiet for 3 full strides. Then, "You can." That evening, Wyatt found the notebook. She'd left it on the kitchen table when she went to wash up before supper, and he hadn't intended to open it. He picked it up to move it, and it fell open to a page near the middle, and he saw his own name. Wyatt expects compliance without knowing he expects it, not arrogance. Habit. Has managed this operation alone for long enough that he's stopped registering that management has edges. Shows respect readily when he encounters competence. Important, he responds to honesty more than deference. Give him information, not reassurance. He stood there holding the notebook and read it 3 times. Then he read the entry below it. Hector fundamentally trustworthy. Loyal to Wyatt, but will speak the truth if asked directly. Important ally. Pete, 3 years of knowledge, 0 confidence that anyone wants it. Handle carefully. Cal watching. Reserving judgment. Hardest to read. He set the notebook down exactly where it had been at the same angle and went to stand by the stove. She was assessing them all. Not maliciously. Not manipulatively. With the same precision she brought to everything else, understanding the human operation of the ranch the same way she understood the physical one. Finding the gaps, the pressures, the things that had been sitting unaddressed, including him. Expects compliance without knowing he expects it. The accuracy of it was not comfortable. It was in fact the kind of uncomfortable that means something true has been said. He was still standing by the stove when she came back into the kitchen. She saw her notebook on the table, looked at him, and understood immediately. "I left it open," she said. It fell open. "Wyatt?" "You're right about the compliance thing," he said. "I didn't know I was doing it until I read that." He turned to face her. "I'm not angry." She searched his face. "What are you thinking?" he said. "About how long it takes to stop seeing the habits you've built and start seeing them for what they are." He paused. "How do you do that? See things that clearly, that fast?" She sat down at the table. Not defensively, as if the question warranted a serious answer, and she was taking the time to give it one. "My father was a very intelligent man," she said. "He also made decisions based on how he wanted things to be rather than how they were. I spent a long time watching that destroy things that didn't need to be destroyed." She folded her hands on the table. "I decided very young that I would rather see what's true than what's comfortable. It's a small pause, not always a popular quality." "In a wife, you mean?" "In anyone." She met his eyes. "But especially in a wife, especially in 1888. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What else does your notebook say about me?" Her expression shifted to something he was beginning to recognize, that not quite smile that meant she was choosing her words with more care than usual. "It says you gave your foreman a share of the spring profits in 1883 when you had no legal or social obligation to do so," she said, "and that you settled a water rights dispute fairly when litigation would have cost your neighbor more than he could afford." She held his gaze. "It says you're a better man than you know you are, and that you've been running this ranch alone for so long you've forgotten what it would feel like to run it with someone." The kitchen was very quiet. "What does it feel like?" he said. "So far." She considered. "Strange," she said honestly. "I keep waiting for the part where you tell me to stay in my lane." And you haven't." "I won't," he said. She looked at him, a long, still look, with those cataloging eyes that missed nothing. And then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and said, "Then let's talk about the forward contract proposal for Bernard Colley. You said he responds better to problems than to numbers. Help me understand how to frame it." He leaned forward. They talked until the supper bell rang, and then through supper, and then after, with the ledgers back on the table and the lamp burning, and the two of them working in the particular rhythm that was beginning to feel dangerously and irrevocably like something that had always been there, waiting to be found. On Friday, Jim Alcott arrived from town and spent an hour with Evelyn's cistern diagram, turning it in his hands, asking questions, re-asking them when her answers were more detailed than he'd expected. At the end of it, he looked at Wyatt and said, "Where'd you find her?" "Boston," Wyatt said. Alcott looked back at the diagram. "She'd draw this herself." "From survey records. She hadn't seen the land yet." Alcott made a sound of pure professional respect. "The grade calculation is right. I'd adjust the inlet angle maybe 3 degrees based on what I saw on the north slope, but the core design is solid." He tapped the paper. "I can have this built in 10 days if the weather holds." "Weather won't hold," Evelyn said from across the room where she was reviewing feed records. She didn't look up. "Barometric pressure has been dropping for 3 days. We'll have significant heat by Monday, and a possible storm system by the end of next week." Alcott looked at Wyatt. "How does she know that?" he said in a low voice, as if she couldn't hear him from 8 feet away. "She reads the almanac," Wyatt said. "And she watches the sky. And apparently she has a method involving the way the cattle have been grazing that I don't entirely understand yet." "Can you finish the excavation before Monday?" Evelyn said, still without looking up. "If I start tomorrow," Alcott said, "then start tomorrow." She turned a page. "I'll have coffee ready at first light." Alcott put on his hat and said his goodbyes and walked out to his wagon. Wyatt followed him to the porch. "You're a lucky man, Calloway," Alcott said, climbing up. Wyatt watched him go without answering. Behind him through the open door he could hear the quiet, steady movement of pages turning. Lucky, he thought. That was one word for it. Saturday brought Jim Alcott and 2 of his men with shovels and timber, and an enthusiasm that Wyatt attributed to Evelyn's 6 a.m. coffee, and the fact that she'd greeted each worker by name and asked a specific question about their trade that made each man feel like his particular expertise mattered. By noon, the excavation was half done. By mid-afternoon, Cal Briggs had wandered over from the trough repair project to watch and was offering unsolicited but accurate advice about the drainage grade, and Alcott's men were listening to him because the old man clearly knew what he was talking about. Evelyn stood at the edge of the excavation with Wyatt and watched it take shape. "This was your idea," he said. "It was in the survey data. Anyone looking for it would have found it. No one was looking for it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Has anyone ever told you that you're good with your men?" He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "The way you handle them. You give clear direction and then you get out of the way. You trust their competence and they know it, so they give you their best work." She kept her eyes on the excavation. "A lot of men in your position manage by visibility, constant oversight, constant correction. It creates resentment. You don't do that." He hadn't thought about it consciously. It was simply how it had always seemed right to operate. "They're good men," he said. "They know what they're doing." "Yes," she said. "And they know that you know it. That's not nothing." He looked at her. She was still watching the work, her notebook open against her forearm, a pencil behind her ear. The sun was heavy, and the air was thick, and her attention was entirely on the thing in front of her. "Evelyn," he said. What do you see when you look at this ranch?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "Potential. Unrealized and waiting." She turned to look at him. "Not failure. I want to be clear about that. What's here is solid. What's here has integrity. It just needs attention. To the gaps." "Like a ledger." "A little like a ledger." The not-quite smile. "Yes." He turned back to the excavation. Alcott's men were singing something low and tuneless, and working with the ease of men who know they're building something worth building. "What do you see," he said, "when you look at me?" The question landed between them. He hadn't entirely meant to ask it. She didn't look away. "The same thing," she said. And then, before he could respond, she turned to her notebook and wrote something down and walked over to consult with Alcott about the inlet angle. He stood at the edge of the excavation and felt the summer sun on his neck and the particular vertiginous sensation of a man who has asked a question and received an answer that is going to take him a long time to fully understand. Potential, she'd said. Unrealized and waiting. He was still working through what that meant when supper came, and the lamp went on, and they sat down across from each other again, with the ledgers and the notebook and the plans, and the quiet that was filling day by day, and page by page, with something neither of them had been expecting to find when they'd agreed to this arrangement. Something that had no column in any ledger Wyatt Calloway had ever kept. Something he was beginning to think he might need to learn to measure anyway. The storm didn't arrive at the end of the week the way Evelyn had predicted. It arrived Monday morning at 4 a.m., and it arrived without warning, in the way that only the worst Texas weather does, not building, not announcing itself, simply there, as if it had always been there, and the calm before it had been the aberration. Wyatt was up before the sound fully registered. He'd spent enough summers in Red Mesa Valley to know the difference between wind that was passing through and wind that had come to stay. This was the second kind. He was dressed and out the door in under 2 minutes. Hector met him on the porch. "Creek's running low," Hector said without preamble. "Been watching it since yesterday evening. Thought it might just be the heat. Now I'm not sure." "How low?" "Low enough that I noticed. Not low enough to panic. Yet." Wyatt looked at the sky. What he could see of it said nothing good. The heat that had been building since Friday had a different quality, now denser with a pressure behind it that pushed on the eardrums and made the horses uneasy. In the barn, he could hear them shifting. "Wake Pete and Cal," he said. "I want eyes on the south herd before first light." Hector was already moving. Wyatt turned to go back inside for his gear and nearly walked into Evelyn. She was dressed fully with her notebook under her arm and her hair pinned back and the expression of someone who had not been asleep. "How long have you been up?" he said. "Since 2. She held up the notebook. I've been recalculating. Wyatt, the creek drop is faster than normal heat drawdown. That pattern in the almanac data correlates with an upstream blockage, not evaporation. Something's damming the eastern fork above us. He stopped. You're sure? Not certain. But the rate of drop matches the 1879 accounts, and in 1879, the cause was a debris dam from the early storm season. If the same thing is happening now, our reservoir will stop refilling within... She checked her calculations. 36 hours. Maybe less. He looked at her. The numbers she'd given him about the 1885 drought came back immediately: 13 days of reserve. At current herd size with the heat they were running, that number was closer to 10. 10 days if the creek was completely cut off and the reservoir was their only source. Minus however much they'd already used this month. I need to send someone up the eastern fork, he said. Hector knows the upper creek terrain. Better than anyone. Send him now before the heat gets worse. I'll manage the herd water schedule from here. She was already opening the notebook to a fresh page. What's your current reservoir reading? Checked it 2 days ago, around 3,800 gallons. I need today's reading, before we do anything else. He got it himself, walked to the reservoir, dropped the measure, brought the number back. 3,300, 500 gallons in 2 days, running at normal summer usage. He told her, watched her write it down and calculate without speaking, her pencil moving fast. At this rate, she said, with the heat increasing, we're looking at 8 days of reserve, not 10. If the creek is fully blocked and we get the dust conditions that follow this kind of pressure drop. She looked up. We could lose animals by day 6. 6 days. In 1885, the drought had taken 17% of the South herd. They'd had 13 days then. Now they had 6 maybe, and a storm building overhead, and an unknown blockage somewhere up the eastern fork, and 30-some head that couldn't be moved fast enough if it all went wrong at once. Tell me what you need, Wyatt said. She held his gaze for a moment, just long enough that he understood what the moment meant. He was not asking for her recommendation. He was not waiting to see if she'd thought of something useful. He was putting the operation in her hands with the same directness she'd brought to everything since she'd stepped off that train. She straightened. I need the current head count by pasture, today's feed and water consumption by section, and peat on the south trough immediately. If the seal's been losing 20 gallons a day, and we're now in a conservation emergency, that loss is unacceptable. Either he fixes it today, or we reroute. She was writing as she talked. I also need to know if you have any stored water beyond the reservoir. Barrels, secondary tanks, anything. 2 iron tanks behind the equipment barn. Haven't been used since '84. Don't know what condition they're in. I'll look at them in an hour. She tore a page from the notebook. This is the water rationing schedule I calculated last night. It's based on minimum survival requirements per head, not comfort. It's not what the cattle prefer. It's what keeps them alive if we hit day 8. He took the page, looked at it. The numbers were precise, and they were brutal, and they were correct. When did you calculate this? He said. Last night, while the pressure was dropping. She looked at him calmly. I hoped I wouldn't need it. I had it ready in case I did. By 6 in the morning, the Double C was running on war footing. Hector was up the eastern fork on horseback with instructions to identify and clear any debris blockage he could manage alone, and send word back if he needed more men. Pete and Cal were at the south trough with the full repair kit and the understanding that a temporary patch was no longer acceptable. It had to hold today completely. The other 4 hands were rotating the south herd to the north pasture in stages, reducing pressure on the south water line, and consolidating the cattle into a range where a single water source could be managed more efficiently. Evelyn was at the 2 iron tanks behind the equipment barn, and she'd recruited young Danny Marsh, the newest hand, 19 years old, who'd been mostly hauling feed since he arrived because he was available, and she needed someone to help her assess what they were working with. Danny had been the most skeptical of the hands. Not openly the way Pete had been, but in the particular way of a young man who has been taught by every prior experience that women give opinions about domestic things and men give opinions about everything else. and whose face had been doing subtle, involuntary math since Evelyn arrived, trying to reconcile what he was observing with what he believed. He stopped trying to reconcile it around 8 in the morning when she identified a hairline fracture in the second tank seam by running her fingers along the joint and asked him to bring pitch and a flame with the confidence of someone who has done this before. "You know how to seal an iron tank," he said. "My father had 2 commercial boilers," she said, already clearing the area around the seam. "I learned because no one else was available to learn." She looked at him. "Hand me the pitch." He handed her the pitch. An hour later, both tanks were sealed and filling from the auxiliary line she'd redirected from the barn water supply. They were adding 800 gallons of reserve. Not enough to change the mathematics dramatically, but enough to buy another day. In a situation where every day was a negotiation, one more day was everything. Danny Marsh worked alongside her without speaking for most of that hour. When they were done, he stood back and looked at the tanks, and then at her, and said, "My mother would have known how to do this." Was she a practical woman? "Most practical person I ever knew." A pause. "My father used to say she was wasted on a farm." "What do you think?" He considered. "I think the farm would have failed without her." He picked up the tools. "I think that's not the same as being wasted." Evelyn looked at him with something that was close to warmth. "No," she said. "It isn't." Hector came back at noon with dirt on his hands and a report that was both good and bad in equal measure. The good, he'd found the debris dam. About 2 miles up the eastern fork, a combination of downed cottonwood branches and accumulated brush had partially blocked the creek exactly as Evelyn had predicted. He'd cleared most of it with his horse and a rope and 2 hours of hard work. The underlying cause wasn't seasonal debris. The cottonwood that had contributed the branches had fallen because its root system was undermined. And the root system was undermined because the bank it was growing on had been eroding faster than normal, which meant the eastern fork had a soil stability problem that wasn't going to be solved by clearing the immediate blockage. Wyatt heard this report at the kitchen table with Evelyn beside him, and he could see her working through the implications while Hector was still talking. "So the creek will flow now," Wyatt said. "For now," Hector said. "But if we get heavy storm runoff up there, which we might with what's building, we could get another blockage. Or we could get the opposite problem. Bank failure means the creek could change course in a bad runoff event." "How bad?" Evelyn said. Hector looked at her. "Bad enough that we might not be routing to the reservoir anymore. Bad enough that the eastern fork might start running toward the Cutter Creek main channel and away from us." Silence. If the eastern fork changed course, the reservoir stopped refilling entirely. Not for a week. Permanently until significant engineering work rerouted it back. Engineering work that would cost more money than Wyatt had liquid, and take longer than any summer drought could wait. "How long before the bank is critical?" Evelyn said. "Can't say for certain. Could be stable for years. Could go in the next hard rain." She looked at Wyatt. He looked at her. There was a conversation in that exchange that neither of them put into words because they both understood it completely. The cistern they'd started building on the north slope wasn't an improvement anymore. It was a lifeline. If the eastern fork changed course, the cistern fed by a secondary catchment area from the north ridge that Evelyn had identified in the survey data would be the only reliable water source on the Double C that didn't depend on Cutter Creek. "How far along is Jim Alcott?" she said. "Excavation's done," Wyatt said. "He was going to start the lining today. I need to talk to him." She was already standing. "If we can accelerate the build." "He doesn't have more men available on short notice." "Then we use our men." She was at the door. "I need 2 hours with him to understand what tasks require a mason and what tasks are labor any able hand can do. We can split the work. Jim does the technical work, our men do the carrying, the filling, the tamping." She looked at Wyatt. "Will your men do that work, a construction job, alongside their ranch duties?" He looked at Hector. Hector shrugged, but it was the shrug of a man who already knew the answer. "They'll do it," Wyatt said, "if you explain it to them." "Then get them together after supper," she said. And tell Jim Alcott I'm coming to the work site now." She was out the door before either man could respond. Hector watched the empty doorway for a moment. "Wyatt," he said, "don't. I wasn't going to say anything bad." "I know what you were going to say." Hector smiled into his coffee. "She calculated this last week, didn't she? The cistern. She knew this was coming." Wyatt thought about the diagram she'd made in St. Louis. The duplicate copy for Jim Alcott. The barometric pressure she'd been tracking since before she arrived. The rationing schedule she'd had ready the night before it was needed. "She knew it was possible," he said. "She built for what was possible. Smart woman." "Smarter than me," Wyatt said, and it came out with no trace of wounded pride, just acknowledgement, just fact. Hector looked at him, then really looked at him the way old friends do when they're confirming something they've suspected for a while. "About time you met someone who was," he said. "God." The afternoon brought the dust, not the storm itself that was still coiling somewhere out west, taking its time, but the leading edge of it, the dry, gritty air that dropped visibility and coated every surface and made the horses press against the far side of their stalls. The temperature climbed past 100, and the hands worked through it with wet rags over their faces, and the grim focus of people who know that complaining won't change the numbers. Evelyn worked alongside them. That was the thing that Pete Dunmore told his bunkmate that night in the quiet, flat tone of someone who has had his assumptions thoroughly revised and hasn't finished processing it yet. She worked, not supervised, not directed from a comfortable distance. She was at the work site with her sleeves rolled and her hands dirty and the notebook abandoned in the kitchen because there was nothing left to plan, only to execute. She helped tamp the cistern lining. She carried timber with Danny Marsh. When Cal Briggs's knee locked up on him in the afternoon heat and he couldn't stand up straight, she was the one who got him seated and brought him water, and then, without making it a point of discussion, redistributed his task among two others so the work didn't fall behind. She did it all quietly, with the specific focus of someone whose internal calculation is running constantly, and whose body is simply the tool the calculation uses. Wyatt watched her from across the worksite midway through the afternoon and felt something he hadn't expected. Not admiration. He'd had admiration since the first day. Fear. Not of her. For her. She'd been up since 2 in the morning, and it was now past 3 in the afternoon, and she hadn't stopped. And the heat was serious in a way that didn't care how competent you were, and she was thin, not unhealthily, but she was a woman who ran herself at a deficit and had done it for so long she'd stopped registering it as a choice. He crossed to where she was working and said quietly so only she could hear, "Evelyn, stop for 20 minutes." She looked up. "We're behind on the east." 20 minutes, watershade. That's not a request. She held his gaze. He saw the reflex, the instinct to argue, to calculate whether 20 minutes was a cost the cistern schedule could absorb. He watched her run the numbers. 15, she said. 20. She exhaled and set down what she was holding. They sat on the shaded side of the equipment barn and drank water and didn't speak for a while. The sounds of work continued around them. The dust moved through the air above them in slow, heavy currents. "I do this," she said finally. "I know. I forget to stop." She held the water cup in both hands and looked at it. "My mother used to say I had a furnace where my common sense should be. She meant it as a criticism." A pause. "I think she might have been partly right. It's kept this ranch from a crisis today," he said. "The cistern isn't finished." "No. But because of decisions you made last week, we have something to build. Without it, we'd be looking at the same options we had in '85, and the answer would be the same." He looked at her directly. "You built us margin, Evelyn, before you knew we'd need it. That matters." She was quiet for a moment. Not the working quiet, a different kind. The kind that means something has been received. "My father used to say that preparation is just optimism with documentation," she said. "Smart man. When he wasn't making catastrophic business decisions, yes. The not-quite smile. He had his seasons." He didn't push further. But he noted the way she said it, the lightness over the weight of it, and he noted the water cup she was still holding, and the way the 15 minutes he'd negotiated down from 20 had become without either of them acknowledging it closer to 30. She needed the 30 minutes. He'd known that when he said 20. She hadn't noticed. That told him something. Supper that night was the fastest and loudest meal the Double C had served since Wyatt had owned it. All 7 hands were at the table, and every one of them had opinions about the cistern construction and the water rationing and the creek bank situation and the storm that was still building to the west. Evelyn sat at her place and listened and asked questions, and when she finally spoke, she had the table's complete silence within 2 sentences. "Here's where we are," she said. "The creek is flowing again, but we can't rely on it through the storm. The cistern will be functional in 4 days if we maintain today's pace. The reserve tanks give us a 1-day buffer. The rationing schedule I gave Wyatt this morning holds. I'd like each of you to look it over and tell me if there's anything operationally I've missed." She passed copies around the table. The hands read them. Cal Briggs asked about the North herd specifically. Pete raised a point about the timing of the morning water rotation that Evelyn hadn't considered. She wrote the correction in immediately without making it a concession. Simply, "You're right. Thank you, corrected." Pete saw that. His face did something. Later, washing up after supper, he said to Hector, "She wrote it down." "What?" "My correction. She just wrote it down, like it was information." "It was information. I know." He was quiet. "I've given corrections before. At my last outfit, the foreman wrote it in his memory and used it against me for 6 months. Hector dried his hands. "She's not a foreman." "No." Pete thought about it. "She's something else. I'm not sure what to call it." "Try partner," Hector said. "It fits." The storm hit fully on Wednesday. Not rain. The cruelest Texas droughts have that quality that they send the wind and the dust and the pressure without the water, like a promise made entirely in bad faith. The dust reduced visibility to a few feet, and the temperature broke its own record, and 3 of the south herd went down with heat stress in the afternoon. Evelyn was at the south pasture when it happened with Pete and Danny. She didn't hesitate. "Get them on their feet," she said. "We're not losing them standing still." "We can't force cattle up in this heat," Pete started. "We're not forcing them. We're helping." She was already moving. "Pete, take the head. Danny, the hindquarters. On my count." It worked for 2 of the 3. The third was too far gone. She assessed it quickly, said, "Get water on it. Shade it with whatever you have. It may recover, it may not. Don't waste effort you don't have. Move to the next one." Pete looked at her. "I know," she said quietly. "I know. But we have 32 other animals that need you functioning. Go." He went. The third animal recovered by evening. Slowly, and then all at once, the way cattle do, down, and then up, and looking mildly offended, the way cattle always do, as if the crisis were a personal inconvenience they'd chosen to survive largely out of stubbornness. Danny Marsh watched it stand and said, "I'll be damned." "Language," Evelyn said without heat. "Sorry, ma'am." He looked at the steer, then at her. "You knew it would make it." "I thought it had a chance," she said. "I didn't know." "But you didn't panic." She considered his face. He was 19, and he'd worked hard that day in brutal heat, and he was looking at her with the specific expression of someone who is in the process of revising a fundamental belief. "Panic," she said, "is what happens when you don't have a plan. When you do have one, you don't panic, you adjust." She brushed dust from her sleeve. "The plan isn't the guarantee. The thinking is. Keep thinking, and you keep your options open." He nodded. Slowly, like something was settling into place in him. That night Wyatt found her on the porch, not working, just sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the dark western sky, where the storm was still doing its slow grinding work. No notebook, no pencil, just her and the night air and the sounds of the ranch settling. He sat down beside her, not close enough to be forward, close enough to be there. They were quiet for a long while. "3 animals went down today," she said. "I heard. They all recovered. This time. She paused. What happened in 85 when you lost the 17%? He was quiet for a moment. You want the honest version. I always want the honest version. I waited too long, he said. I kept thinking it would break. The drought. I kept thinking another week, and the creek will come back another week, and we'll be fine. And I watched the reservoir drop and told myself it wasn't as bad as it looked, and didn't start rationing until we were already behind. She was quiet. I've told myself for 6 years that it was the drought, he said. That it was unavoidable. But it wasn't entirely the drought. Some of it was me not wanting to see what was in front of me. She turned to look at him. In the dark, her expression was something he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the precision. Not the calculation. Something quieter and more personal. You built a good ranch, she said, with those habits and those gaps and all of it. You built something real. Not as real as it could be. Nothing is, she said. That's not a flaw. That's just the nature of things. She turned back to the sky. We're going to get the cistern finished. The creek will stabilize. The herd will come through. You sound certain. I'm not certain, she said. But I've looked at the numbers, and they're survivable if we keep doing what we're doing. A pause. And I have $400 of feed contract savings coming to us next quarter that I haven't told you about yet because I wanted to confirm it first. He turned to look at her. You closed the collie contract. I sent the letter Friday. He responded today. The not-quite smile, and in the dark, it was something more than that. He said, and I quote, "Tell your wife she drives a hard bargain." He sounded pleased about it. Wyatt laughed. It came out full and real, and it surprised him the ease of it, the way it arrived without effort, without performance. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. Evelyn was watching him when the laugh settled. Her expression was open in a way it hadn't been before, unguarded the way a person gets when they've worked through a hard day together and the formal distances have burned away in the heat. $400, he said. 420 technically. You're going to be very dangerous to my sense of self-sufficiency, he said. She looked at him steadily. Or, she said, you could decide that self-sufficiency and partnership aren't mutually exclusive. The night was heavy and hot, and the storm was still moving in the west, and the cistern was 4 days from completion, and there were 32 head that needed the morning water rotation checked, and a creek bank that needed monitoring, and a south trough seal that Pete had fixed today, but that needed to be verified tomorrow. All of that was true. All of it was waiting. And Wyatt Calloway sat on the porch of the Double C with the woman who had walked off a train 8 days ago, asking about water ledgers, and felt for the first time in a very long time that the weight of all that waiting was being carried by more than one pair of hands. He didn't say anything, neither did she. But she didn't go inside, and he didn't either. And they sat there together in the dark while the storm worked its way east, and the cistern waited on the north slope to be finished, and the Double C held on quiet and stubborn and still standing. The cistern held its first water on a Thursday morning 4 days after Evelyn had said it would. Jim Alcott stood at the edge of it with his hat in his hands and the expression of a craftsman looking at work he's proud of, and said, 1,480 gallons at capacity. Close enough to your 1,500 that I'll call it a win. Evelyn looked at the water line, then at Alcott. It's exactly right, she said. Thank you, Jim. He waved it off, but he was smiling when he turned away. Wyatt stood beside her and didn't say anything for a moment. He was doing the arithmetic. 1,480 gallons on top of the recovered reservoir, on top of the 2 iron tanks that were holding and being replenished by the auxiliary line. The creek was flowing again, reduced, but reliable enough for now. The rationing schedule had held through the worst of the dust storm without a single animal lost. They'd come through it, not without cost. 3 hands had worked themselves to exhaustion and needed a full day's rest. Cal Briggs's knee was going to bother him for another week at least. The south pasture grass was damaged and would need to be rested through the remainder of summer into fall. And the eastern fork bank was still a long-term problem. It hadn't gotten worse in the storm, but it hadn't gotten better, And both Wyatt and Evelyn knew it was a conversation they'd return to before winter. But they'd come through it. Wyatt looked at the water in the cistern and thought about 1885, and the 17%, and the particular silence of a ranch that has lost animals it should have kept. He thought about waiting too long to see what was in front of him. "Evelyn," he said. Thank you." She turned to look at him. Of all the things he'd said to her in the 3 weeks since she'd arrived, this seemed to be the one she was least prepared for. Something moved through her expression, not embarrassment, but something adjacent to it. The reaction of someone who has been useful their entire life and has rarely been thanked for it directly. "You don't need to," she started. "I know I don't need to. I want to." He held her gaze. "You built the thing that saved this ranch before I knew the ranch needed saving. That's worth saying plainly." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, "We built it. Your idea, your design, your schedule, your men, your land, your trust." She said the last word like it mattered, which told him it did. "You didn't question me, Wyatt. You handed me authority during a crisis before you had any proof it was warranted. That's not a small thing." He thought about the notebook. The entry she'd written about him responds to honesty more than deference. He thought about how she'd read him accurately from 600 miles away from land records and court filings before she'd ever seen his face. "You'd read me well enough," he said. "You knew I'd do it." "I knew you might," she said. "There's a difference." Alcott's wagon was pulling away. The hands were dispersing to their morning tasks. The Double C was settling back into its rhythms, the altered, improved rhythms that had been changing daily since June 14th. "Let's walk the south pasture," Evelyn said. "I want to see the grass damage for myself before we talk about the rotation timeline." He walked with her. He'd been walking with her for 3 weeks now, through every section of the Double C, and he'd learned something about himself in the process. He saw his own land differently, with her beside him. Not worse, more completely. She asked questions that made him look at things he'd been walking past for years. "The grass will recover by October if we pull the herd by August 1st, she said, looking at the damaged southern section. "We'll want to reseed the worst patches. Do you have seed stock? We can get it from Morrison's outfit. He keeps a good mix for this soil. Can we get it on credit, or do you need cash?" "Cash, but we have it especially with the Collie contract savings." She nodded, and he could see her folding that into a calculation she was already running. "Then we reseed in mid-September. The first cool rains will do the work for us." She turned to look at the herd, which had been moved to the north pasture and was grazing in the dense, undamaged grass there with the contentment of animals that have survived something and know it the way cattle sometimes seem to know. "They look well." "They're well because you rationed them at the right time." "Pete caught the timing error in my schedule," she said. "Without his correction, the morning rotation would have been 20 minutes late, and in that heat, 20 minutes matters." She looked at Wyatt. "He saved us animals he'll never know about." "I'll tell him." "Tell him specifically," she said. "Not just good work. What he actually did and why it mattered." She paused. "He needs to know his knowledge has value here. He's been holding it at arm's length for 3 years. I don't want him to do that anymore." Wyatt looked at her profile. 3 weeks in, and she was managing the emotional architecture of his crew with the same precision she'd brought to the water schedule. Not manipulating, genuinely caring. Understanding that people were a resource the same way water was, and that they needed the same attention to thrive. "You should have been running something," he said, "long before this." She kept walking. "I was running something. My father's household, his creditors, his remaining assets." A pause. "The difference is that here I have authority. Here, when I make a decision, it can actually be implemented." She glanced at him. "That's not nothing, Wyatt. That's everything." He heard what was underneath it. 6 years of competence in a context that didn't let competence matter. 6 years of being the most capable person in a room that wasn't hers. He heard it, and he didn't try to diminish it or redirect it into something more comfortable. "It's yours here," he said. Whatever you want to run, it's yours." She was quiet for 3 strides. "That's a significant thing to offer." "I know what I'm offering." Another silence. Longer. The kind that means something is being weighed seriously. "The feed contracts," she said. "And the Eastern Fork Bank situation, I have thoughts about a longer-term solution that might involve a land easement with the property upstream. Do you know who owns that section? Gerald Hatch. He's reasonable. I'd like to approach him before winter. If we can negotiate a maintenance agreement for the bank above us, we're not managing that risk alone anymore." She turned to look at him fully. "And I want to look at your cattle insurance situation. I don't think you have the right coverage for your current herd size." "I don't have any coverage for the current herd size," he said. "Haven't updated the policy since '83. She stopped walking. He stopped too. "Wyatt," she said with the specific tone of a woman exercising enormous restraint. "I know. We could have lost the herd this week and recovered nothing. I know. I'm going to draft an updated insurance assessment, and I'd like you to review it by the end of the week." "Yes," he said. "And then sign it and send it." "Yes, Evelyn." She held his gaze for a moment, checking he understood for genuine compliance versus placation. She found what she was looking for and turned back toward the ranch. "Good," she said. "Now tell me about Gerald Hatch. What's his relationship with water on his property? Does he use the Eastern Fork?" He told her. And they walked back through the south pasture together, talking about land and water and the upstream neighbors' grazing habits, and Wyatt noticed with a warmth he didn't try to name that sometime in the past 3 weeks he had stopped measuring the distance between himself and the woman walking beside him. The evenings changed. It happened so gradually that Wyatt couldn't have said exactly when it started, only that somewhere between the crisis and its resolution, the kitchen table after supper stopped being a working session and started being something else. Not less productive, just different, more elastic. The ledgers and notebooks were still there, but they were opened later and closed earlier, and the time in between was filled with conversation that ranged further than water schedules and feed contracts. She read in the evenings when the work permitted it. History mostly. Political economy. A botanical manual that she'd apparently found in a box of donated books at the Red Mesa Junction General Store, and had been reading systematically ever since. He found the botanical manual on the kitchen table one evening, left open to a chapter on drought-resistant grass varieties, with her handwritten notes in the margin in her neat, precise script. Cross-reference with Morrison's seed stock. Ask Wyatt if buffalo grass suits the south pasture soil. He stood there reading her margin notes, and felt something that had been building for weeks arrive with a kind of quiet certainty, the way certain truths arrive not in a moment of revelation, but in a moment of recognition. As if the thing was already there fully formed, and you simply turned your head at the right angle to finally see it. She'd been taking notes for him. In a book she was reading for herself, she'd been writing down the things she thought he should know. He was still standing there when she came in from the porch where she'd been talking to Hector about the north fence repair schedule. She saw him with the book. "The buffalo grass chapter is relevant to the south pasture question," she said, as if explaining. "I know." He held it up. "You wrote my name in the margin." A brief pause. "I thought you'd want to know about the seed variety." "You were reading for yourself, and you were thinking about what I needed to know." She met his eyes. The lamp was low between them, and she was still in her work clothes, and her hair had come partially loose the way it did by the end of every day, and she looked at him with an expression that was more unguarded than she probably intended. "Is that strange?" she said. "No," he said carefully. "It's not strange at all." He set the book back down open to the same page the way she'd left it. "The buffalo grass would work for the south pasture," he said. "I'll ask Morrison about it." She looked at the book, then at him. "I'll write the inquiry if you'd like." "I'd like that," he said. They sat down at the table. He poured coffee. She opened her notebook, but she didn't start writing. Immediately she sat with her hands around the cup and looked across at him with that careful considering gaze. She had the one that saw more than it disclosed. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask me anything." Have you been lonely out here before? The word landed in the space between them and sat there specific and honest. He could have deflected. He'd spent 11 years building the capacity to deflect that particular frontier habit of converting emotional truth into a practical statement. He didn't. Yes, he said. She nodded. Not with pity. With the recognition of someone who has felt the same thing and is deciding whether to say so. I have been too, she said. In Boston, in a house full of people. She looked at her cup. Loneliness isn't always about the number of people around you. No, he said. It's about whether any of them are actually there with you. She looked up. He held her gaze and didn't retreat from it. You're here, he said, simply, as a statement of fact. I am, she said. The kitchen was quiet. The ranch was settling into night sounds around them, horses and wind, and the distant low conversation of the hands in the bunkhouse. The lamp burned steadily between them. Your father, he said after a while. What happened to the business? She was quiet for a moment, not reluctant gathering. He trusted the wrong man, she said. A business partner who had access to the financial accounts and used them for his own investments without my father's knowledge. By the time I found it, I was managing the household books, not the business accounts, or I'd have caught it sooner. There was almost nothing left to recover. Her voice was even, but underneath it was something that had been lived with for a long time. The partner left Boston. There was no legal recourse that my father could afford to pursue. I'm sorry. My father recovered some of his health eventually, not all of it. She paused. He knows I'm here. He approved the arrangement. He was, a small, complicated pause, relieved, I think, to know I would be somewhere I could use what I know. Wyatt thought about the woman she'd described running household accounts managing creditors, finding the fraud in the books late enough that it couldn't be stopped, doing the work of a financial manager with the title of oldest unmarried daughter. He should have been prouder, Wyatt said. He was proud, she said. He simply didn't know what to do with it. Pride in a daughter's intelligence in 1888 is, she considered, a complicated thing to express in a world that doesn't have a clear place for it. It has a place here, Wyatt said. I want to be clear about that. She looked at him across the table, and for the second time since he'd known her, something in her expression shifted entirely past the precision, past the calculation, past the careful management of what she disclosed. Something younger and more vulnerable showed itself briefly, like a light coming on in a window. I know, she said. That matters to me more than I've said. He leaned forward slightly, not crossing the distance, acknowledging it. Then say it, he said. The things that matter, say them. She looked at him for a long moment. I didn't expect to feel safe here, she said. I expected to be useful and respected, and I thought that would be enough. I'd trained myself to think that was enough. A pause. It turns out that enough and what you actually needed are sometimes quite different things. He understood exactly what she meant. He'd been telling himself for 11 years that the double C was enough, the work, the land, the routine, the satisfaction of a well-run operation. He'd built a life around the premise. Yes, he said, they are. The lamp burned between them. The night pressed warm against the windows. Neither of them moved to open a ledger. It was Cal Briggs who said it first, because Cal Briggs at 61 years old had stopped finding any social value in not saying things. He said it to Hector on a Sunday morning while they were checking the north fence repair work. She loves this place, Cal said. Hector kept his eyes on the fence line. She's been here a month. Doesn't take long with some people. My wife knew she was home the first morning she woke up on our property, said the light looked right. Cal tested a post. Evelyn's not looking at the light, she's looking at the numbers, but the feeling's the same. Hector was quiet. And he's gone on her, Cal said. Has been for 2 weeks. He just hasn't figured out that he has permission to know it yet. Since when do you pay attention to this kind of thing? Since always. Cal moved to the next post. I just don't usually find it worth remarking on. This one's worth remarking on. Hector thought about the kitchen light that had been on until midnight 3 nights running, and not because of ledgers. Thought about the way Wyatt had reorganized his entire morning schedule so that it ended at the kitchen table instead of the barn, a change so gradual that Hector doubted Wyatt had noticed he'd done it. He's careful, Hector said. He's scared, Cal said with the accuracy of a man who knows the difference. He built this place alone for so long that wanting help feels like weakness. Wanting company, he paused, feels like admitting he was wrong to go without it. Was he wrong? Cal shrugged. He did what he did with what he had. Now he has more. He tested the last post on the repaired section. Holds, he said. Good work. They walked back toward the barn in the Sunday quiet, and didn't say anything else about it because men like Cal and Hector had the particular gift of knowing when a thing has been said fully enough. The twist arrived on a Wednesday in the form of a letter. It came from Boston addressed to Evelyn in her father's handwriting, and she read it at the kitchen table after supper while Wyatt was in the barn settling the horses for the night. He came back in to find her sitting very still, with the letter on the table in front of her, and her hands folded on top of it, and an expression on her face that he hadn't seen before. Evelyn, she looked up. My father is ill, she said, more seriously than he indicated in his last letter. He crossed the room and sat down. How serious? His doctor thinks it's his heart. She said it evenly, the way she said everything difficult straight ahead, no cushion. He may not, a pause. It may not be a short illness. Wyatt looked at her, at the stillness of her hands on the letter, at the expression that was not quite grief, yet the face of someone who has received bad news and is giving it the time and space to become real before they respond to it. Do you need to go to him? He said. She looked up. Boston is 4 days by train, I know. He held her gaze. Do you need to go? I can't leave now. The Eastern Fork Bank situation is still, Evelyn. His voice was quiet and clear. I'm not asking about the Eastern Fork. She stopped. I'm asking, he said, if your father needs you. The stillness in her face broke. Not into tears, into something more honest than that. The specific expression of a person who has been taking care of everything and everyone for so long that the offer of someone taking care of them lands like a physical thing. I don't know yet, she said softly. The letter is 2 weeks old. It may have the situation, may have... Send a telegram tomorrow morning, he said. First thing, we'll know more within 2 days. She looked at him. And if he needs me? Then you go, he said. The Double C survived before you. It'll survive while you're away. She looked at him for a long moment. You'd manage without me. I managed before you. He kept his tone even. I'd rather not go back to it permanently, but for 2 weeks, 3. Yes, Evelyn, I'd manage. She looked down at her father's letter. Read it again, or the same line of it, he couldn't tell. Then she set it down and pressed her hands flat on the table the way she did when she was settling a decision. Send the telegram tomorrow, she said. First thing, he agreed. She didn't say anything else. He didn't push her to. He got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat back down and opened the nearest ledger. Not to work, just to be present and occupied to give her the company without making the company a demand. She sat with the letter and the coffee, and he sat with the ledger and the lamp burned between them, and the night was just the night. After a long while she said, He would have liked you. He'll like me in person, Wyatt said. We'll visit him properly once the Eastern Fork situation is resolved. She looked at him. There was something in her expression so unguarded, it almost hurt to look at the face of someone who has just been handed a future they hadn't known they were hoping for. You'd come to Boston, she said. If you wanted me to. You'd leave the ranch. Not forever. For long enough. He met her eyes. He's your father, Evelyn. That means he's mine too now. The quiet that followed was the deepest kind, the kind that happens when something has been said that can't be unsaid, and both people in the room know it was true. "I'll draft the telegram tonight," she said, "so it's ready first thing." "All right." She pulled a sheet of paper from her notebook, dipped her pen, started to write. He watched her hands move across the paper, the same hands that had mapped this ranch from a survey document that had sealed iron tanks in 100-degree heat, that had corrected a water rationing schedule at midnight, and tamped cistern lining alongside his ranch hands. And he felt the thing that had been building for weeks arrive fully and completely, the way water arrives when a dam gives way, not gradually, all at once. He was in love with his wife. He sat with that knowledge in the quiet kitchen and let it be what it was. He didn't analyze it. He didn't set it aside for a more convenient moment. He simply looked at her writing her father's telegram at his kitchen table and understood with the same clear-eyed certainty she brought to everything that the Double C had a heart it hadn't had before, and she was it. "Wyatt," she said without looking up. Thank you for all of this, for not making me ask." He understood what she meant. She'd thanked him for authority and trust during the drought. This was different. This was the thank you for being seen not as an asset, not as a resource, not as the competent woman who saved the ranch. As a person, as a daughter, as someone whose father was sick and who needed someone to care about that without needing her to manage it. "You don't thank family," he said. "You just do for each other." She looked up. He met her eyes and held them. She turned back to the telegram. But the pen in her hand was still for a moment, just a moment before it moved again. And outside, the Texas night was cooling towards something that was almost a hint of autumn, and the cistern on the north slope was full, and the south herd was grazing in the north pasture where the grass was thick, and the Double C held everything it held with the quiet, solid confidence of a ranch that has come through something hard and knows now what it is made of. The telegram went out Thursday morning. The answer came Saturday. Her father was stable, improving slightly. Not out of danger, but better than the letter had suggested. His doctor was cautiously optimistic. He wanted her to stay where she was, he'd written in his careful hand. "You sound well, Evelyn. You sound like yourself. Stay." She read it at the kitchen table. Wyatt was beside her. She set the telegram down and put her hand over her eyes for a moment, not hiding, just needing a moment of darkness to absorb the relief. He put his hand over hers. She didn't move away. She turned her hand over and held his, the way you hold on to something real when the relief is so large it makes you briefly weightless. They sat like that at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning in August 1888, and the lamp between them was unnecessary because it was full daylight, but neither of them had turned it off. And outside the Double C was exactly what it had always been, and entirely different than it had been 6 weeks ago, before a woman with a leather notebook had stepped off the noon train and asked a question about water ledgers and changed everything. Cal Briggs was right. She loved this place. And the man sitting beside her was long past the point of needing permission to know it. She told him on a Tuesday morning in October at the kitchen table before the coffee was finished. Not with preamble, not with careful framing. Evelyn Brooks Calloway, who had spent her entire adult life managing the delivery of difficult information with precision and composure, simply set down her cup, looked at Wyatt across the table and said, "I'm expecting a child." The kitchen was completely still. Wyatt put down his own cup very slowly. He looked at her. She was watching him with that steady gaze she had opened, direct, giving him the information and the space to receive it, without managing his reaction for him. She'd learned, or he'd learned, or they'd learned together that this was how they did things. "Are you certain?" he said. "I've been certain for 3 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I wanted to know what I was telling you." 3 weeks. She'd been carrying this for 3 weeks, calculating, confirming, making sure she understood what she was delivering before she delivered it. Of course she had. "How are you?" he said. She blinked. He understood she'd expected questions about timing, about the ranch, about logistics. Not that one. "I'm well," she said. Then, more honestly, "I'm a little frightened." He got up from his side of the table and came around to hers and sat in the chair beside her, and she turned to face him, and he took both her hands in his, the way he had on the Saturday morning when her father's telegram came, not ceremonially, not with performance, simply because her hands were there, and he was there, and the distance between them was unnecessary. "Don't be frightened," he said. "That's not a useful instruction." "No," he said, "but I mean it anyway." She looked at him. Something in her face, the tension she'd been carrying with the information for 3 weeks, released. Not entirely, but enough. "Spring," she said. "April, I think, maybe late March." He thought about April on the Double C. The calving season would be winding down. The South pasture would be recovering. The Eastern Fork Bank negotiation with Gerald Hatch, which Evelyn had initiated in September and which was now producing a formal maintenance agreement, would be finalized by then. He thought about a child on this land, growing up watching Evelyn work through ledgers and watching him walk the fence lines and learning from both of them the specific, unglamorous, profoundly real work of keeping something alive. "April," he said. "Good." She looked at him carefully. "That's all you have to say?" "No," he said. "I have a great deal more to say. I'm working out where to start." The not quite smile, and by now he knew every version of it could read the degrees of warmth behind it, like a barometric instrument. This one was warm all the way through. "Start anywhere," she said. He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat if she paid attention. "I am going to be a very poor hand at expressing this adequately," he said. "So I'll say it plainly, and you can translate it into whatever language suits you. I am glad. More glad than I have words for. And I'm not frightened at all." He paused. "Because you're not frightened of anything that actually matters. You're just frightened of the unknown, and that's temporary." She looked at him for a long moment. "I told you I was frightened." "You told me a little frightened," he said. "You were managing the delivery." A genuine smile, the real one, the rarer one, the one that changed her whole face. "You've learned to read me." "I've had 4 months of intensive study." He kept her hand against his chest. "We're going to be all right, Evelyn. Better than all right." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. And the way she said it, not as reassurance, not as performance, but as a conclusion she had calculated from available evidence and found to be sound, was the most Evelyn thing she had ever said to him. He laughed. She laughed with him. And the kitchen morning moved on around them the way mornings do, indifferent and ordinary, and entirely unable to understand how much the world has just changed. Hector took the news with a nod and a handshake and went directly to the bunkhouse to tell the others which Wyatt had expected. What he hadn't expected was Cal Briggs appearing at the kitchen door 20 minutes later with his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said to Evelyn. "Cal." He stood there for a moment with the particular posture of a man who has something to say and is assembling the courage to say it. 61 years old, former cavalry, harder to read than any man on the ranch. "My wife had our first in a house less well-built than this one," he said. "In weather worse than anything you'll see here. She was the toughest person I ever knew." He paused. "You remind me of her." Evelyn looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "Highest one I know how to give." He put his hat back on. "Congratulations to you both." He turned and walked back to the barn. Evelyn watched him go. Then she looked at Wyatt. "That man," she said quietly, "is going to make me cry, and I never cry." "He has that effect," Wyatt said. "It's a gift." Bet. October moved through the ranch with the dry, clear efficiency of the best Texas autumn weeks. Cool mornings, warm afternoons. A sky that had the particular blue of a season that knows it's temporary. The herd was consolidated and healthy. The south pasture was recovering. The cistern was performing exactly as designed, and Jim Alcott had sent a letter saying he was recommending the design to 2 other ranchers in the valley with Evelyn's name attached. She'd written back to decline the attribution. Alcott had written again to insist on it. Wyatt had intercepted the second letter, read it, and told her she was outvoted. "You designed it," he said. "Your name goes on it." It was a practical solution to a local problem. That 3 other ranches may now build, which means 3 other ranches may have water through the next drought that they wouldn't have had otherwise. He set the letter in front of her. Write back and say yes. She wrote back and said yes. He didn't tell her that Alcott had also written to him separately to say that 2 ranchers in the valley had already started asking who'd trained her as an engineer, and that his answer had been, nobody trained her. She just is one. The forward contract with Bernard Colley renewed in October, with terms even better than the first round. Colley had come to the second negotiation, having told his brother-in-law about the arrangement, and the brother-in-law had asked to be included, which doubled the volume and reduced the per-unit cost further. Evelyn had spent an evening with the revised numbers and then put the ledger down and said, "We're saving $600 a year on feed." $600, Wyatt said, annually, at current pricing. If prices rise, the savings increase. She paused. That covers the insurance policy update and the Gerald Hatch easement fees with money left. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, looked at the ceiling. $600. $640 technically. He laughed. She smiled. The ledger sat open between them and the lamp was low, and she had her ink-smudged hand and her half-loose hair, and she was 3.5 months pregnant, and she was recalculating the margin on a feed contract at 9 o'clock at night, and he thought, this is the life. Not the idea of a life. The actual thing. "Come to bed," he said. "The $40 will still be there in the morning." She looked at him, the real smile. "It will," she agreed, and closed the ledger. Chatsag. November brought Gerald Hatch to the kitchen table. He was 60 weathered and had been ranching the section above the Double C's Eastern Fork for 22 years. He came in suspicious. Wyatt could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he evaluated Evelyn when she extended her hand, and he sat down across from her with the posture of a man preparing to be sold something. She didn't sell him anything. She put the survey maps on the table and the bank erosion data she'd been compiling since August and the proposed maintenance schedule, and she said, "Mr. Hatch, the bank failure above us affects your property before it affects ours. The Eastern Fork changes course. You lose the riparian buffer that's been managing your North Field's moisture for 20 years. I'm not asking you to solve our water problem. I'm asking if we can solve a shared problem together." Hatch looked at the maps. He was quiet for a while. "Who drew these?" he said. "I did," Evelyn said. He looked at her, at Wyatt, back at her. "From what survey?" "The county records from 1879 and 1885, cross-referenced with the erosion measurements I've been taking at the fork since July." "You've been measuring the fork since July." "Monthly. The rate of erosion is accelerating. At current pace, you have 2 to 3 years before the bank becomes structurally compromised." She pointed to a notation on the survey. "Here, the root exposure from the cottonwood loss is the leading edge of a larger instability. It wants to be addressed before it becomes expensive." Hatch looked at the maps for a long time. Long enough that the kitchen was silent, except for the small sounds of the house settling in the November cool. "What's the maintenance agreement look like?" he said. "Annual cost sharing for bank reinforcement. We bear 60%, you bear 40%, proportional to the land area affected." She slid the draft agreement across the table. "I've had it reviewed by a lawyer in Red Mesa Junction. It's straightforward." He read it, turned to the second page, read that, turned back to the first. "Calloway," he said without looking up. "Gerald," Wyatt said. "Your wife wrote this?" "She did." "She have legal training?" "No." Hatch put the agreement down. He looked at Evelyn with an expression that had moved somewhere in the last 20 minutes from suspicious to something considerably more respectful. "My lawyer is going to tell me this is fair," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. "I wrote it to be fair." He extended his hand. "Send me the final copy when you're ready." She shook it. "I'll have it to you by the end of the week." He put on his hat and stood, and then paused at the door in the same way Cal Briggs had paused 2 months earlier. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Hatch. The valley's had a hard decade with water." He settled his hat. "Nice to see someone thinking about it properly." He walked out. Wyatt waited until the sound of the wagon had faded. Then he looked at Evelyn. She was already writing up the final agreement notes. "You knew he'd say yes," Wyatt said. "I knew the case was sound. I knew he was a reasonable man, you told me that." She didn't look up. "I don't count on outcomes. I count on arguments." "What's the difference?" "If your argument is right and the other person is reasonable, the outcome takes care of itself." She turned a page. "I've found that most people are reasonable when you respect them enough to show them the truth." He sat across from her and watched her write and thought about what the Double C looked like in June, the South Trough losing 20 gallons a day. The feed costs running $400 over where they should be. The North Fence, original construction liability. The insurance policy, 6 years out of date. The East Fork Bank eroding toward a crisis, and what it looked like now. Fixed. Every one of those things addressed and fixed or in the process of being fixed. Not by crisis, most of it by October, before the crisis conditions could return. By a woman with a leather notebook and a 4:30 wake-up habit and the particular intelligence that makes the difference between seeing what's there and seeing what's possible. He thought about the telegram he'd written to his own brother in September, when news of the drought had circulated through the valley and neighboring ranchers had started asking how the Double C had come through so cleanly. He'd written "married well" and left it at that. His brother had written back, "I need to know who negotiated this." He'd written, "She negotiated herself." December arrived with a cold that meant business, and with it a letter from Boston. Not from her father this time, from his doctor. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table. Wyatt watched her face. "He's worse," she said. "How much worse?" "The doctor doesn't think he'll see spring." She set the letter down flat on the table and put both hands on it, the way she put her hands on documents that required steadying. "He's asking to come here." Wyatt was very still. "Your father wants to come to Red Mesa Valley. He doesn't want to die in Boston without seeing where I am." She looked up. "He wants to know what I built." "What I built. Not what I married into. What I built." "Write him today," Wyatt said. "Tell him to come as soon as he's able to travel. He may not be Evelyn, write him today." Her hands pressed flat on the doctor's letter. "The baby will be visible by the time he arrives." "Good," Wyatt said. "He'll get to know about it in person." She looked at him across the table with an expression so full it had no room for the precise, controlled vocabulary she usually applied to things that moved her. She simply looked at him, and he looked back, and the kitchen held what it held. "I'll write him today," she said. "Good." She got out paper and her pen and started writing, and he stayed at the table across from her, and neither of them needed to discuss what had just been decided, because it had been decided the only way things got decided in this kitchen, by saying what was true and then acting on it. January 3rd, 1889. The blizzard announced itself the way the August storm had, with pressure and silence, and the particular quality of air that knows it carries something serious. But where August's storm had been heat and dust, January's was cold and white and utterly indifferent to the plans of anyone living inside it. Her father, Edward Brooks, had arrived 2 weeks earlier, thinner than his photograph, and moving slowly, but with eyes that were sharp and a mind that was, as Evelyn had said on the platform at Red Mesa Junction, when she described his best qualities, still completely intact. He'd spent the first 3 days in the armchair by the kitchen stove receiving an education in the Double C that was delivered in installments by Evelyn, who brought him the ledgers and the maps and the contracts and the cistern design with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone showing a parent what they'd made. Edward Brooks had looked at the cistern design for a long time. "You drew this," he said, "from the survey data." "Before you'd seen the land?" "Yes." He'd looked at the feed contract next, the hatch easement, the insurance policy update, the pasture rotation schedule that had by December resulted in the south pasture recovering ahead of projection. "Evelyn," he said. "Father, I owe you an apology." She'd looked at him carefully. "For what?" "For every year I didn't make sure you had a room that was large enough for this." He gestured at the documents, but he meant more than the documents. She understood. He was 64 years old and his heart was failing, and he was sitting in a kitchen in Texas looking at evidence that his daughter had built something real, and the apology was for all the years the world had given her a closet when she needed a room. "You did what you knew," she said. "I should have known more." She sat down beside him and took the cistern design from his hands and set it on the table. "Help me think through the spring reseed plan," she said. "I want to know what you think about the grass variety selection." He'd looked at her, then at the reseed plan she was unfolding. "I don't know anything about grass varieties." "You know how to look at numbers and find the logic in them. That's all I need." She smoothed the paper. "Look at this." He looked. And they'd worked through it together, the man who had lost his business and his health and come across the country to see his daughter, and the daughter who had turned every competency he'd failed to adequately recognize into something that was keeping 30-some cattle alive, and a marriage whole, and a ranch moving towards something better than it had been. He cried once quietly when he thought she wasn't looking. She was looking. She didn't say anything about it. She just kept explaining the reseed plan. The blizzard that began January 3rd was still going on January 5th when Evelyn woke Wyatt at 2 in the morning and said calmly and clearly, "It's time." He was dressed in under a minute. He'd been half expecting this. She was 3 weeks from her calculated date, but she'd told him 2 days earlier with the precision of a woman who has been tracking her own body, the way she tracked the cistern water level, that she thought it would be earlier than predicted. "I need Doc Farley," she said. "The blizzard?" "I know." Her voice was steady. "Hector knows the road." He was already at the door to the bunkhouse. Hector was up, had been up instinctively the way old ranch hands sometimes are when the house is generating a different quality of tension than usual. He had his coat on before Wyatt finished speaking. "Roads are bad," Hector said. "I know. I'll get him." He was gone before the sentence finished. Into the blizzard without drama, with the simple directness of a man who knows what the task is and does it. Wyatt went back inside. Evelyn was at the kitchen table, not in distress focused. She'd already stoked the stove and put water on and organized with characteristic efficiency everything she knew would be needed. Her father was up awake, standing in the doorway to his room, with an expression of controlled fear. "What do you need me to do?" Edward Brooks said. "Sit with me," Evelyn said. "Talk to me. Tell me about something ordinary." He sat down beside her. He talked. He told her about a summer when she was 7, and they had taken a trip to the coast, and she had refused to come inside from the water until the sun was completely gone, and her mother had eventually given up arguing and simply sat on the beach beside her. He talked about it with the detail of a man who had been turning that memory over in his mind for 25 years and knew it perfectly. Wyatt moved through the room, checking the stove, checking the supplies, checking the road through the window every few minutes for any sign of Hector. He listened to the old man talk and watched his wife breathe through the pain, with the specific, methodical focus she brought to everything, not fighting it, but managing it, the way she managed a rationing schedule, working with what she had. "Wyatt," she said at one point. He was beside her immediately. "Here." She held his hand the way she'd held it on the Saturday morning of her father's telegram. The grip of someone using the reality of another person to anchor themselves when the ground is moving. "I'm not frightened," she said. "I know. I'm a little frightened." "I know that too." He kept her hand. "Hector will have Farley here. And if he doesn't make it in time, then we manage with what we have." He kept his voice level. "You've told me that's the principle." She almost laughed. It came out as something else, and then she was breathing through it again, and her father kept talking about the beach in 1868, with the calm and steadiness of a man doing the one useful thing available to him. Doc Farley arrived at 4:15 in the morning, covered in snow, and entirely matter-of-fact, with the equanimity of a man who has delivered babies in worse conditions than this, and knows it. He assessed Evelyn, told Wyatt and Edward to go to the kitchen, and told Evelyn she was doing exactly what she should be doing. "I know," she said. "Of course you do," he said, and got to work. Clara Calloway was born at 6:47 in the morning on January 5, 1889, during a blizzard that had buried the Double C under 18 inches of snow overnight. She arrived with the particular insistence of a person who has decided and is not interested in debate, which, as Hector said later, was entirely appropriate. Wyatt heard her first cry from the kitchen and felt his hands shake for the first time since he was 19 years old. He hadn't known they could still do that. Edward Brooks, sitting across the table, put his hand on his son-in-law's arm. The two men sat there in the kitchen of the Double C in the early morning of January 5th, listening to the cry of the newest person on the ranch, and neither of them said a word because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have diminished it. Doc Farley appeared in the doorway. "Healthy girl," he said. "And your wife as well. She's already asking for her notebook." Wyatt stood up so fast he knocked his chair back. Farley held up a hand. "Give her 5 minutes. She's fine. She's more than fine." He shook his head. "I've been delivering babies in this valley for 30 years. I have never in 30 years had a woman ask for her notebook inside of 10 minutes. He looked at Wyatt with an expression that contained professional respect and something close to awe. "She wants to document the timing." Wyatt laughed. It came out half laugh, half something else entirely. He gave her 8 minutes, then he went in. She was sitting up. Clara was in her arms, small and red-faced, and already somehow looking at the world with the skeptical attention of someone who has arrived somewhere unexpected and is forming opinions. Evelyn looked at Wyatt when he came in, and her face was open in the way it was only in the deepest private moments between them. No precision, no management, just her fully present holding their daughter. "She's here," Evelyn said. "She's here," he said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter for the first time. Clara looked back, or seemed to, 7 minutes old and already with those considering eyes. "She has your eyes," Evelyn said. "She has your expression," he said. "That one you make when you're deciding something." Evelyn looked down at Clara, laughed quietly, exhaustedly with everything she had. "God help us," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, actually leaned the way she very rarely allowed herself to, with the full weight of what she was carrying. He held the weight. He could hold it. "Your father is in the kitchen," he said. She looked up. "How is he?" He cried. She closed her eyes briefly. He can wait 5 minutes." She settled back against him. Clara made a small sound and resettled, and the three of them were still for a moment in the early January morning, with the blizzard pressing against the windows and the stove working in the other room, and the Double C wrapped in snow around them. "Wyatt," she said. When I stepped off that train in June, I was prepared to be useful. I was prepared to work hard, and to be respected, and to manage whatever the situation required." She paused. "I was not prepared for this." "For what?" She kept her eyes on Clara. "To want to stay," she said. "Not because the arrangement is good. Not because the work is meaningful." She looked up at him. "Because this is home. This specific place. These specific people." Her voice was even, but he knew her well enough now to hear what was underneath. "I didn't know I was coming home when I stepped off that train. I thought I was coming to a job." He looked at her, at Clara, at the room around them that was part of the house she'd diagnosed and improved and inhabited and made into something that hadn't been there before her. "You were coming to a job," he said, "and then you made it into something else. That's what you do." She held his gaze. "What do I do?" "You see what's possible," he said, "and then you build it." She looked at him for a long moment, with the clear, steady gaze that had been cataloging him since the first second on the platform, and that he now understood completely was not assessment anymore. Hadn't been for months. It was how she looked at the things she loved. "We built it," she said. "We built it," he agreed. Edward Brooks held his granddaughter for the first time at 7:30 that morning, sitting in the armchair by the kitchen stove, with the blizzard still making its case outside, and the coffee hot on the stove, and Hector and Cal and Pete and Danny and the rest of the hands moving quietly around the ranch in the snow, doing what needed to be done the way they always did. He held Clara and didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally looked up, Evelyn was watching him from the doorway, with Wyatt beside her. "She'll run something," Edward said. "She'll run this," Evelyn said. He looked at the baby in his arms, then at his daughter, then at the man standing beside his daughter with his hand in the small of her back, steady and present, and entirely sure of himself in the particular way of a man who has found the ground under his feet to be exactly what he thought it was. "Yes," Edward said. "I think she will." The Double C survived the blizzard of January 1889 without losing a single head of cattle. The cistern held through the freeze. The south pasture came up in April, stronger than it had been in 5 years. The forward contract with Bernard Colley renewed again in spring, with terms that made Colley's brother-in-law send a separate letter of appreciation that Evelyn filed in the ranch records without comment. Gerald Hatch's bank maintenance work began in March ahead of schedule, because Hatch had mentioned the easement agreement to 2 neighboring property owners who had asked to join it, turning a bilateral negotiation into a valley-wide water management cooperative that Evelyn had quietly and without particular fanfare become the coordinator of. Jim Alcott told anyone who asked that the cistern design was the best work